I'm not sure that his marital status had much to do with it. The first single male to win Wimbledon. But great heroes and villains there. My heroes have joined me in the studio here on the Mother of All Christmas podcasts. They are the dynamic duo of Stacy Herbert and Max Keiser. Welcome, my friends. The authors and producers and presenters, not only of the Keiser Report, the award-winning, now I think 3 times a week or more. In fact, I seem to see it every time I turn on my television.
Yeah, it plays in your brain over
Russia
and over
Today.
again, even when you stop watching it. It just plays over and over again. You can't stop watching it.
You can't stop watching it, and most importantly, you can't forget what you saw there. I've just watched a trailer for your next episode, which by the time this comes out will have been very widely watched. But I've now seen more of you than I have ever seen before, including your naked torso,
Exactly.
as you imitated the porcine rulers of the United Kingdom, David Cameron and George Osborne, whom you likened to pigs with their snouts in the trough. And you did it in the most graphic way. And I congratulate you on that. I say, for the benefit of my wife, who's just stood up as if to leave the studio, that I do not intend to do the same on our Russia Today program, which is, of course, Sputnik. And both of our shows are doing very well by the grace of God and our talent that God gave us. But the truth is, isn't it, Max?
Yes.
That though you and I and Stacy and Gayatri are now, you could say, television personalities, our first love really is radio. And
No doubt
that's why
about it.
we are behind these microphones now. So let me tell you, before we kick this discussion off, that one of the purposes of this podcast is to lay the foundations for the launch next year, crowdfunded, of a radio station, a real talk radio station. Stacey, you're up for that?
Oh, yeah, and the audience loves it. People love radio, and we get demands for that all the time, even for our Keiser Report. People want it as a podcast.
Yeah.
They said that video would kill the radio star, but it hasn't.
No. Well, I think in talk radio, it's no replacement for it. And unfortunately, in the U.S. and in the U.K., talk radio is dominated by the right side of the spectrum. And
Well, in the US, definitely. In fact, in Britain, we are the only developed country in the world that has no national commercial talk radio station. There's LBC serving London only. There was TalkSport, which had mainly sport, but had in the evenings and overnight real talk about things other than sport, but which has now gone over to 24/7 sport. So there is now no national commercial talk, and I think we've got to fit that bill. Each of us got a following, we've got a reach, and we've got a market. So I think we need to replicate what we have in the United States, which is a proliferation of talk radio, but sadly, as you say, dominated by the most extreme right-wing voices. In fact, Rush Limbaugh and people like that. We can be the shock jocks of an alternative.
yeah,
point
I've
of
always
view.
thought there's room for a shock left. What some people consider to be a bit of an oxymoron, but I don't think there is. If there's a Rush Limbaugh who's shock right, there's a room for a shock left. But you just can't get shock left in America. You can't get any hard-hitting left-wing opinions in America. They talk about the New York Times as being a liberal newspaper, but it's right of center. All the media is either center, right of center, or extreme right of center. There's no real left of center media in America, unfortunately, and they really need that because the country is suffering from a saturation of right-wing views, and it's not working.
That's partly because those who own the capital that's necessary to invest in radio, and we'll come to alternative ways of funding these things in a minute. But it's partly also because people on the right know the price of everything and the value of nothing, but people on the left often know the value of everything and the price of nothing, and are not able, it would seem. I mean, there was an attempt, wasn't there, Air America, in the US. There was an attempt to have an alternative media channel, and it miserably failed because it didn't know the price of anything and didn't even count the numbers right. Stacey?
That's true. I think you see that with the progressive voices, like the Jeremy Scahill situation here recently. There's a real desire on the part of the so-called left to be accepted. They're so afraid of anybody saying, of not being accepted by the elite in a way, that they're marginalized, being marginalized in any way. Whereas, for example, Max and I would say are more left-wing, I would guess, politically. But almost all of our guests, many of them are right-wing because they're so open. They never question, they're never like, how is this going to impact my perception? You know, how will people perceive me if I appear on here? They're so managed on the left. Everybody's afraid to say anything. So
that's a very good point. You know, on Sputnik, which you help us produce, I'm glad to say, we have no difficulty at all in attracting big figures from the establishment, OBEs, MBEs, Knights of the Realm, and so on.
Right.
Whereas
all
left-wing
conservative,
people sometimes don't want to come on because your nuance on this conflict or this issue doesn't quite meet the PC standard.
Well, I think that's really... John Kampfner wrote a fantastic piece in the New Statesman about this, the outrage, this sense of outrage that you see on Twitter. And it's mostly about the progressives, though. They're like afraid that you can't say that word, or you can't show support for that sort of...
My wife goes out vox popping in the street, as you know. She had to go and buy a coat the other day because she was wearing a vintage, rather fetching, short fur jacket. When it dawned on us that if she appeared in that fur jacket, nobody would talk about anything else in the show but the fact she was wearing fur. Max?
Well, I think the point Stacy makes is an excellent point. And, you know, we've run into the same thing that you've run into, is that on the right, no problem getting guests. On the left, when we were doing Al Jazeera, the films for Al Jazeera during the Gulf War Part 2, we had people cancel who were more left-wing, and they were afraid to come on the show. They were afraid to be associated with different media outlets. But on the right, they simply let their message speak for itself. The right is much more organized, and they stay on message. And the left is constantly splintering into subgroups. That's been my observation, is that within the left, there's always a subgroup within the left, and they're constantly splitting within that group, and there's infinite amount of splitting, and therefore they achieve no economies of scale. You know, going back 7 or 8 years, I tried to rectify that situation by introducing something called Karma Bank, where I try to get the left to all agree to boycott one thing at a time based on the vulnerability of that company to a boycott. So I did like a Wall Street analyst. I said, let's look at all these companies and look at them in two ways. Which companies are the most hated and which are the most vulnerable to a boycott? And by vulnerable to a boycott, I mean, if you don't spend $1 at that company, does it impact their market capitalization the most? So looking at these metrics, there are some names that pop up. Exxon is a hated company, but it doesn't have vulnerability to a boycott. Coca-Cola was not as hated as Exxon, but it's extremely vulnerable to a boycott. So using that metric, I said, let's go and boycott Coca-Cola. And by doing so, we could simultaneously move a lot of money using the system, using the tools that we have, to the victims of Coca-Cola in India or Colombia or wherever. So I went to the head of Greenpeace, who was the managing director at the time. I pitched him this idea. And he said, I understand what you're saying, and I understand it would work, but we can't alienate our users by coming to them with a solution that touches on finance or business, because that'll alienate them. They won't give us that $5 at the corner that we go out every Christmas to raise money for Greenpeace. It's too alienating, even though I know what you're saying will work. And now here's Greenpeace, an organization, a fine organization. They've got 100 million euros sitting in the bank doing nothing. They say it's for legal defense fund, and I point out to them, you're keeping the money in the banks who are then lending it to the corporations that you're fighting against. You're enabling the corporations you're fighting against. You're doing more harm by keeping money in the bank. If you just dissolved Greenpeace, the environment would be better off, because by not knowing the economics of what you're doing, you're causing more harm than good.
Unbelievable. What a great story. I mean, let's explore just one more of these examples. We work for Russia today. It is said by some on the left that President Putin is somehow anti-gay, as if gays were somehow persecuted in Russia. Now, actually, I don't agree with the recent measures taken in Russia about the promotion, as they put it, of a gay lifestyle and restricting that. I didn't agree with it when Mrs. Thatcher introduced it in Britain, so I can hardly agree with it if President Putin introduces it in Russia. But gays are not persecuted, imprisoned, tortured, driven, shunned from public life in Russia, but they are in the Persian Gulf. And in the Persian Gulf, there's a certain television station that you just referred to, Al Jazeera. And what we have is the absurd situation where some people will not come on Russia Today on the grounds that Russia is somehow not gay-friendly, but they will go on Al Jazeera, where if you are gay, you better not tell anybody or you'll end up in a dungeon.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's like a liberal mafia, basically. And I think that Jeremy Scahill is a good example. Jeremy Scahill is going to come on our show, Keiser Report, to talk about his new film, Dirty Wars. But at the last minute, he canceled because his handlers decided that Russia Today was somehow not friendly to the liberal mafia. So he canceled. So we ended up interviewing a red pepper. We had a vegetable on the stage, and we said, this will be Jeremy Scahill. We'll attempt to do the interview as best as we can. He chickened out at the last second, so we're going to do the best that we can. But you see, that, in my opinion, is a mistake that people on the left often make, because they're not. The problem is they don't have the confidence in their message. The liberals, at the end of the day, they don't really believe what they're saying. Whereas on the right wing, they don't question what they say. They're sure that what they're saying is correct. The liberals are not so sure. They're haunted by self-doubt.
And because of that, they always align with power. Because, as you mentioned, we made those films for Al Jazeera. And at the time, Donald Rumsfeld and George Bush and Tony Blair were going to bomb Al Jazeera.
And did bomb it. Bomb it.
None of our liberal contacts would appear on the network. All of these right-wing people would. Then it was acceptable. Then they liked Qatar because Qatar was financing all these, revolutions everywhere and jihad, whatever. But now they're acceptable because they always align with power. The power says Al Jazeera is good now, so it's filled with all of these left-wing liberals in America. Al Jazeera America hired all of these liberals. But again, they don't, even though there's actually much more interference, I think. There's actually some interference from Al Jazeera, the government, when we were there. This is when we first left, is that Saudi Arabia had, it was all government interference. Something happened between the Arabic Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera English, and now there's Al Jazeera America. But there was some government interference. A lot of people quit. We've never seen that with Russia Today in all the years that we've been there. But here you have these progressives who just won't listen to it. They're outraged, and they've made up their mind that they won't hear any other voices. They don't want to hear other voices.
What a fascinating scene. Actually, we could have our whole discussion on this, but we better not, because there's at least two other significant items I want to discuss with you two. The first is, and you're, I know, pioneers of it, and you've advised me very successfully on it, is this question of alternative means of funding media, film, books, political campaigns, and others. In the past, you had to, if you wanted to be on the media, pass through a prism which involved billionaire owners of media outlets and those they hired who were hired to think like them and to run the outfit in their image. Now, with the proliferation of new media and stations like Russia Today, for which we all work, like Press TV, for which I work, like Al Mayadeen Television, for which I work in the Middle East, now these billionaire owners don't have to be pleased. I don't care if I'm never invited back on Sky News, because I reach far more people by other means. I don't care if I'm never invited back on the BBC, because I reach far more people other ways. In addition to that, we now have this phenomenon known as crowdfunding. And I have raised more than 3 times the amount I sought to raise for the making of the feature-length documentary, The Killings of Tony Blair, which we'll be discussing later in the show. And this crowdfunding phenomenon is growing and growing. Max, tell us how it works and where it's going.
Well, I think it's just contrasting a centralized approach to media and finance versus a decentralized approach to media and finance. And what you described there is, in the past you had to go through a series of gatekeepers, and the distribution is very centralized and it's monopolized. In Hollywood, for example, they have 6 major studios and they dominate in an oligopolistic fashion the distribution of films. And so you have to kind of work your way into that very small group. But crowdfunding, and with the internet as a distribution model, totally breaks up that oligopoly, and it allows, like yourself, to go directly to the consumers who eventually will watch the film as potentially putting up some cash and getting a premium or a reward to help finance that film. And in so doing, their collective efforts are picking and choosing what media, what films get out there in the public domain. So the chance of a successful project actually goes up, because in Hollywood, William Goldman famously said nobody knows nothing when he's describing what goes on in Hollywood. But on the crowdfunding platforms, and there are dozens of them, you can see that a lot of people know something, because they're picking to put crowdfunding behind projects that have very successful commercial lives when they get out of the crowdfunding platform. So it's happening in media, it's happening in technology, it's happening in hardware. And this goes back to something that I was also involved with back in the 90s, this idea of the wisdom of crowds, or using markets and distributed decision-making to help not only create more efficient decisions being made, but helping to shape markets so that they're serving the public interest better, which is actually more of a right-wing issue. Most people think of markets as being right-wing, and they don't. Nobody on the left ever looks at markets as being potentially
as a democratic mechanism.
Yeah, as a way to be a democratically distribution of risk and reward. And I've often tried to make the point, especially to the left wing of the political spectrum, that markets offer ways to get the dissemination of opportunity out there in ways that are at least competitive. I mean, I would argue that they are superior than what the left puts forward as more of a centralized system of decision making. And here you have a perfect example. I mean, you have a fantastic film, The Killings of Tony Blair. It's obviously a highly political film. It's obviously a film that would not be financed in the UK by BBC or Channel 4. And yet you have a personality around the world that supersedes your local personality here in the UK. So you can tap into that using the internet, and the cost efficiencies of the internet are incredible because of the relative cheapness of communicating on the internet. You can raise 160 triple the budget in pounds, and you're off and running. So this is, again, for me, this whole political divide between right and left, my main contribution to this is that the left needs to look at the economics of things and markets as a way to further their ends. And I think this is a fantastic example of that. You are obviously not a right-wing political figure. However, you're using a market to achieve a left-wing goal. So does that make you a right-wing personality? No. It just means that the markets have untapped potential for people on the left. And my message for the last 10 years has been the left needs to explore that potential and tap into that potential. They're ignoring it needlessly. Wow.
Now, you have set up your own crowdfunding platform. Are you in a position to talk to us about that?
Yes, we are launching a crowdfunding platform in January. It's called Start Join, and it'll bring not only crowdfunding as we know it today, but it'll also have a very heavy component of Bitcoin, which is hugely...
That's the third subject I want to come on to.
So Bitcoin will be a big part of this crowdfunding platform, and also we are bringing some things to the party that I think will make us very competitive very quickly in the crowdfunding space. It'll be the only UK crowdfunding site that I think will be competitive on a global basis. There are a few UK-based crowdfunding sites today. I think we're going to try to position ourselves as up there with the 2 or 3 majors around the world. And so we're very excited. So it should be January when that kind of opens up.
And that's going to be called Start Join.
Exactly.
Explain that name.
Start Join. Well, you can start a project or you can join a project. So you can start a film like you have done. You started the film, you listed the film, and then other people joined you. So they joined in and became sponsors of that film. So it's you can either start or join a project.
Well, count me in. I'll join.
Okay.
Anything that you have got going, I'll happily join. And I wish I had that view many years ago when I interviewed you for the mother of all talk shows, on TalkSport, because I interviewed you some years ago now on a subject which has become really a bit of a sensation. You talked about Bitcoin. And let me confess to you, I had absolutely no idea what you were talking about. I hope it didn't show. It probably did show to you. I hope it didn't show to the listeners. But talk about flying by the seat of your pants in an interview. I'm interviewing an expert, and a very articulate one, about a subject that is literally, it's like I'm listening to someone talking in Chinese. Now, since then, if I had taken the implicit advice that you were giving and invested in Bitcoin, well, I wouldn't need to be here because I'd already be a multi-millionaire. Tell
right.
the listeners out there who are as untutored on this subject now as I was back then, what are Bitcoins?
Well, it comes out of the internet, and you compare it to things like, for example, Napster. We all remember P2P file swapping. They revolutionized the music business by putting up music files on the web and using people's hard drives to store files, and then you could access those hard drives and you could swap music, and it did a complete end run around the music industry, and the cost of the music went to zero, and it totally transformed the music industry. So Bitcoin is a protocol that cobbles together tens of thousands of computers, and they're working in parallel to solve mathematical equations per this protocol that's been released onto the internet back in 2009. And as they do so, Bitcoins are birthed onto the internet, and they're shared amongst these nodes or miners. And at first, it was unclear whether people would use this as a means of exchange, as a currency. But what's happened in the ensuing years is that we've had a lot of crises. We had the financial crisis of 2008. We had Cyprus blowing up. And we've had Argentina going through changes, Venezuela going through changes. And people have realized that as a store of value, they can put their money into a Bitcoin, and it retains its value, and it has value. So it is now being treated as a currency. I think one of the criticisms of Bitcoin, someone will say, well, what's the intrinsic value of a Bitcoin? It just sounds like a lot of math. But you could say the same thing about email. I mean, what's the intrinsic value? If you had 10,000 emails in your hand, on your thumb drive, it has really no value at all. There's no intrinsic value to it at all. It's just digits. And yet email, after being born 15, 16, 17 years ago in a more commercial sense, is now worth, obviously more than $1 trillion or so in value globally, in commercial value. Bitcoin is a protocol, like email is a protocol. And as such, it can be used as a currency. It was designed to be used as a currency. The designers were extensive in writing about it when it was launched, that they were unhappy the way the banking system was failing. And it's the perfect currency for the internet. So as all business moves on to the internet, credit cards are not designed for the internet. Cash is not designed for the internet. Gold and silver are not designed for the internet. There needs to be a currency for the internet, and that currency is Bitcoin. And it's doing to the banking system and to the central bank system what Napster and P2P file swapping have done to the music industry. They've cobbled together the network that is the internet. They've monetized it. They've created this protocol, and they've created a currency to go with it. And that's why the banks are quite frightened by this, because last week, for example, somebody moved $150 million from point A to point B over the internet. The cheapest you could do that with any commercial bank was $200,000 in fees.
Wow.
In Bitcoin, it costs 39 cents.
Well, look, that raises a vital question. The music business tried and failed to stop Napster and its subsequent developments. It tried and failed. Are the banks, the governments, the financial system trying to stop Bitcoin?
Yes, they will, because it cuts into their profits the same way that the music industry cut into the music industry profits. So the banks, obviously, they want those fees, but Bitcoin offers a way to cut around all those fees. Think about the remittance business. All the millions and billions of dollars that are sent home from people working in different countries back to their home countries. They're charged for a $200 remittance, maybe 10 or 12 bucks. If you're living in a country where your annual income is not much, $2,000 or $3,000, that adds up. That's real money. If you're using Bitcoin now, all those fees disappear. They go to zero. And we just had a case where a university in Cyprus was able to accept students from Kenya who the cost saving on using Bitcoin, because they accept Bitcoin at the university in Cyprus, was such that he could then afford for the first time to go to university. So that has made a remarkable change in that person's life due to the cost savings of this Bitcoin transaction, that the university is now accepting Bitcoin.
And the appreciation of this currency has been phenomenal. I mean, it's been ups and downs, but the recent appreciation of it has been something phenomenal.
Right. So the way to look at the value of it, and all the Bitcoins in existence times the current price, and then that would be the capitalization or market capitalization. So if you look at that as compared to, let's say, Western Union or a company in that money transmission business. So Western Union might have a market capitalization of $3 or $4 or $5 billion. Bitcoin is now worth roughly 12 or 13 billion dollars. It's about worth half of the total above ground stock of silver, which is another currency that people use. The thinking now is that Bitcoin should eclipse silver because it's a lot more practical than silver as a store of value and sending money. So that would be a $22 to $23 billion valuation. That's double the current price. Then you start looking at the fact that it could also cut into the way banks do business, the way title insurance is done. All those businesses combined have market capitalizations that are maybe $2 to $3 to $400 billion. So Bitcoin currently at 12 billion. It has many, many, many multiples yet to go. The Winklevoss twins from the Facebook story.
The ones who say they were robbed of Facebook.
Right. They put out a valuation recently of $400 billion they believe Bitcoin will achieve in the interim period. So that's up from 12 or 13 billion. So we're talking potentially, here's another estimate from a very smart fella in Stockholm who started the Swedish Pirate Party. His name is Rick Folkvinja, who we've had on our show many times. Very, very smart guy. He simply said this: look, if Bitcoin captures between 1% and 10% of the global Forex market, which I don't think is an unreasonable expectation at this point because of the cheapness and the ease of which you can send this money, that has an implied price per Bitcoin of between 100,000 and $1 million.
Wow. Staggering. Max, you're a very considerable genius. Stacy, what's it like? Is a genius a nuisance to live with at home? You're appearing on screen. You're appearing on screen. I saw you startled as his buttons began flying on that trailer, and his torso began to emerge.
Well, it's fun, and I'm glad I get to share him with the world now. But, speaking of this Bitcoin, the other thing about it is, in this age of financial fraud, it's a public ledger. So you can't defraud anybody. It's thousands and thousands of anonymous people around the world have to confirm on the public ledger that unit of Bitcoin you're transferring to, say, Kenya is a legitimate coin, and you can't double spend it. Right now, our system is that it's our command and control governments that say, here's the currency, we impose it upon you, you have to pay taxes in it, and here's the banking system, the too big to fail banking system. We outsource our trust to them. They're the ones that organize all of our financial affairs. So a lot of the resistance to Bitcoin at first was that we need these people to impose trust and order on us. How can you just rely on all of us to trust each other and not defraud each other, and for it to be legitimate?
Yeah, again, that's kind of a left-wing approach to organizing society, is that it's based on mutual trust. There's no central authority.
There are no elites. It's just the system. Everything's equal on this ledger, and
there's a lot of sharing that's going on. Again, it sounds as though it's non-competitive, but it is in a lot of ways both competitive and sharing at the same time. So again, it's getting into this area where the division between left and right is extremely porous.
I saw that Alderney, one of the Channel Islands, this week, indicated that it was going to set itself up as a kind of world headquarters of Bitcoin. Is that likely to be a development?
It could happen. Cyprus also wants to be the Singapore of Bitcoin, or the City of London of Bitcoin. So now the countries that are vying for this have been countries that have been shut out over the many decades, and they see this as an opportunity, whereas the UK and the US are, stalling, and they're trying to protect their infrastructure and the status quo.
They're sticking with the old money for now.
Yeah, and so, but just in the last week, though, we've seen now Wall Street firms are coming out and tripping over themselves for an opinion on Bitcoin, because it is generating a lot of media hype. And on Wall Street today, perception is price. In other words, all stocks, all bonds, all currencies, the price is based purely on perception. There's no underlying value to any of these securities. The FTSE 100 is worth negative infinity. There's no value there because of the enormous debts. So it's all based on showmanship. So CNBC or BBC, when they talk about the FTSE 100, they're doing a show called The Stock Market, and they have dancing stock prices that are supposed to indicate value. But there is no value there. The value left the building 30 years ago. There's nothing. It's a hologram. It's purely a hologram. And so because the perception is such, they realize that Bitcoin is grabbing a lot of that media hype. And so if they don't stay in the spotlight, then their hologram collapses because no one's looking at it anymore. It's like Heisenberg principle of uncertainty. It's only there if you look at it. Wall Street's only there if you look at it. The City of London's only there if you look at it. Once you don't look at it anymore, it disappears because there's nothing there. So if I'm looking at Bitcoin and not at the City of London, the City of London disappears. There's nothing there. It's built on mirrors and holograms.
Mirrors and holograms. What a metaphor for the economic system we currently enjoy or endure. Stacy Herbert, Max Keiser, thanks for joining us on the Mother of All Christmas podcasts.
Yeah.
Last night an MP saved my life. There's not a